Wopke Hoekstra is the European Commissioner for Climate Action and a staunch advocate for environmental sustainability. He has been instrumental in shaping policies that address climate change across the European Union. With his extensive background in finance and public service, Commissioner Hoekstra brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to fight against one of the most pressing challenges of our time. Welcome to Columbia BizCast. I'm your host, Fahad Ahmed. And in this episode, we'll listen in on an event co-sponsored by Columbia's Climate School and Columbia Business School's Tamer Institute that features Commissioner Hoekstra and renowned climate economist Professor Gernot Wagner, senior lecturer in the discipline of economics and faculty director of the Tamer Institute's Climate Knowledge Initiative. During this episode, you'll hear Commissioner Hoekstra as he explains why climate change is one of the top 3 global challenges not only for the European Union, but also for the United States. You'll also learn about the work streams the European Union is prioritizing to tackle climate change, including citizen engagement, adaptation, smart regulations, and creating a level playing field. Commissioner Hoekstra also shares his perspectives on how China's position on electric vehicles and hydrogen make achieving that crucial playing field even more challenging. It was a privilege to have Commissioner Hoekstra speak at our school. We start this episode with his opening remarks, followed by a sit-down conversation with Professor Wagner. I hope you enjoy this episode.
So, ladies and gentlemen, dear students, it is a great pleasure and also a great honor to stand here in front of you today as we discuss what I feel is truly one of the most pressing challenges of our time, or I should rather say your time, and that is climate change. But first, let me share with you how pleased I am to be in New York again. To be honest, I've been hooked since 1992. I was 16 at the time, and I spent a month with a host family in Pennsylvania. And this family brought me to New York for my very first time. And since then, I have, of course, often returned to the U.S. As the Dutch Minister for Finance, for Foreign Affairs. Oh, sorry, I'm very clumsy, so this is probably going to happen more often. And as European Commissioner. And I have been a fan, an absolute fan of this country for decades. Like many in my family, many in my country, and many in Europe. And we are deeply connected and share hundreds of years of history and I would argue of values. Every time my presence brings me back to that sense of a shared journey and collaboration between Americans and Europeans from the personal to really the global level. So dear students, this kinship brought our societies truly a lot. And we may sometimes forget through our daily experiences that Europe and the US are 2 truly unique places to live in, thanks to our values, thanks to our prosperity, and thanks to our individual freedoms. But that same freedom, that same democracy, prosperity are under severe attack. And we are facing a range of truly immensely difficult challenges, and they will stay with us for years and in all likelihood for decades to come. And I feel that we must brace ourselves because we are on the brink of ever more geopolitical unrest. First, war is back on European soil. And don't think this war doesn't affect the United States. Yes, Russia's brutal aggression in Ukraine might be directly aimed at Europe. But it truly has a global impact. It is, as a matter of fact, a geopolitical standoff. But in my view, it is also a litmus test of our credibility and whether we will or will not truly show the resolve we say that we do. Or that dictators across the globe can basically wait and sit us out. So what we do or what we don't do, in my view, will echo years into the future. Second, China's geopolitical and economic power play is becoming more problematic by the day. Beijing is running a strategy to make our continents more dependent on its crucial raw materials and technology, while at the same time making itself less dependent and hence more powerful globally. And our third joint struggle is a global one per se, and that is climate change. Climate change is truly fundamentally changing the world as we know it. And it will result in rising sea levels, in increased floodings, it will threaten farming, it will threaten food supply, human health and infrastructure. And the scientific evidence, as I'm sure everyone knows over here, the scientific evidence of climate change is overwhelming and unequivocal. Temperature records, rising sea levels, shrinking ice sheets, souring oceans and extreme weather events all point out that our climate is changing, and as a matter of fact, it is changing rapidly. And human activities, and particularly us burning fuels, fossil fuels, are the primary cause. Over 97% of climate scientists who are publishing on the topic agree that human-caused climate change is real. And that shows that climate action is not a belief. It's not a religion. It is an absolute necessity. And therefore, there's a whole range of actions I feel we need to take going forward, and that should be on the top of our agenda. Let me mention three of them. First, I would like to deep dive on what I feel we should do at home. Second, on the level playing field that we need going forward. And third, on doubling down on diplomacy to make sure that the world in general delivers. So first, what it is that we need at home. Today we have literally wildfires in Portugal and California. Southeast Asia is severely flooded, and Storm Boris is causing widespread damage in Poland, in Romania, in Austria and the Czech Republic. And of course, Europe is rushing to provide support. And as we speak, a hurricane is hitting Mexico's Pacific coast. In Nigeria, severe rains recently caused a dam to collapse, displacing over 1 million people. Droughts in Zimbabwe and Namibia threaten food supplies and wildlife, and Brazil is facing the worst drought in 70 years, as the minister explained in vivid detail to me yesterday. Rising temperatures have prompted warnings that summer temperatures in cities like Paris, Madrid, Miami and Houston will regularly exceed 50 degrees Celsius, and that is 120 degrees Fahrenheit. So, dear friends, the increasing frequency and severity of these events are, of course, extremely worrying. And this isn't just a massive problem for the planet. If we don't act, it will ruin our way of life, damage our economy, damage our security at a truly global scale. Now, with great affluence, like we have here in this part of the world, like we have in Europe, in my view also comes great responsibility. So the European Union and the United States simply cannot just be waiting for others to fix this. They need to lead. And we have both embarked on that journey. The European Union is fully committed to achieving climate neutrality by 2050. And as part of our broad climate strategy, we've set a legally binding target of 55% greenhouse gas emission reduction by 2030. And progress so far is, if you look at the numbers, actually encouraging. We've already reduced our emissions by over 30% as of 2023. 55% by 2030 is the first step on our way to 100% reduction in 2050. If you then look over here, the US Climate Action Plan aims to put the US on a path to achieving net zero emissions by 2050 as well, and cutting greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to roughly 52% by 2030. So the big target is there. But according to the latest data, the US greenhouse gas emissions have only been reduced by approximately 20% compared to levels of 2005. So I do hope, and I do articulate in the conversations I'm having, that the US will do more going forward. And going ahead, there are three work streams that will become ever more relevant. First, to continue the journey towards climate neutrality beyond this decade, we must guarantee that our citizens, our populations, stay on board. The vast majority of citizens see that climate change is a huge problem and want us to fix it. But when they see what it also means at the same time for their energy use, the energy use in their homes, or the cars that they drive, they are afraid for what it means for their way of life. What Europe will do is set out a pathway for reducing 90% of emissions by 2040 towards climate neutrality in 2050. And in order to make sure that that happens, we will need to ensure that our businesses are still around and are able to innovate, and that we give citizens the clean solutions and a transition that is fair for all. And that is, for many citizens, the heart of the matter. So Europe will strengthen and adapt its climate framework. Now, alongside our targets, we will present a clean industrial deal. As a matter of fact, it will happen in the first 100 days of the new Commission. A deal that should make clean energy available and affordable for our industries. And with new reforms that allows them to cope with energy prices in that transition. And you might have seen the statistics, energy prices in Europe are dramatically higher than, for example, in the US. And that makes doing clean business far easier, from basically mobilizing investment to quicker permits for projects to get stuff off the ground. And to me, these are some of the key ingredients for a clean industrial deal that seals the bigger deal in society for a truly successful transition. Secondly, we must be better prepared to adapt to climate change that is already happening. So you have the domain of mitigation, but adaptation is ever more in focus. We do live in societies where we must prepare for more heat waves. And it is unfortunate, but it is very much necessary. More heat waves, more droughts, more floods, and more extreme weather. Our infrastructure, from dikes, a Dutch specialty, to roads and energy infrastructure, healthcare and other critical infrastructure, must simply become climate-proof so that our economy and our basic services keep on running when the weather actually turns extreme. In Europe, our funding of the transcontinental transport infrastructure requires also to be truly climate-proof. And we will need to do more of this going forward in more fields in the next 5 years, alongside better government planning, and alongside a thorough problem-solving dialogue on new ways to ensure our companies and citizens against these effects. This is truly a huge challenge for insurance companies who basically see they cannot continue the way they have been insuring in the past. And third, no matter how many laws we enact or money we put aside, smart rules that let markets work for climate, in our experience, are by far the most superior pathway. And in Europe, the tool that has proven to be the most effective thing that we have done in the whole realm of climate action is putting a price to carbon. Putting a price on the tons of carbon that, say, a cement plant actually emits. And that then triggers the company to find the most cost-effective way to cut emissions and to basically literally avoid that price. Basically in a market-based way. And what it also does is that pricing carbon then actually creates revenues that you can then reinvest into greening the economy. Our way of pricing carbon, our emissions trading system, if you look at the statistics, if you look at the numbers, is by far the most effective thing we have done on European soil. So I will continue to discuss this also with my US counterparts, because if we only do this in the European market, it will lead to unfair competition, but we're also punching below our weight. On the other hand, if we do it together, it will dramatically boost innovation and carbon exposure, and that will be benefiting everyone. And if more and larger emitters across the globe will use it, we truly create a global movement. So, ladies and gentlemen, dear students, then on the level playing field. Technological innovation is one of the essential factors in boosting sustainability. Renewable energy sources, electric vehicles, enhanced waste management, think about the circular economy, and precision farming are all examples of how we can minimize environmental impact and conserve resources. Technological innovation isn't just the right thing to do for the planet. As many of you know, it is also great business. And on both our continents, we see clean tech leaders emerging. From Nextera and First Solar in the US to Fastnet investors in Europe, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of others, often competing at a truly global scale. And that competition, in my view, truly is a good thing. So the EU and the US can be economic partners and at the same time compete in this domain. Competition, and I'm preaching to the converted here, I think, competition basically is pushing the limits of possibilities and innovation and speeding up what I would call positive change at better prices for our consumers. And it is that type of entrepreneurship that has built the US and that has built the countries in Europe. So let's continue on that. But let's at the same time make sure that that competition truly is fair. And the reality is that is not the case. That simply is not the case. Both the European Union and the United States face the fire of unfair competition, especially from China. Plain and simple, we do have a China problem. Take, for example, the electric car industry. China is currently subsidizing its EV car industry with billions and billions of dollars. And the reason for these subsidies is simple. It will give them a dominant position in the car market, and it is killing competition. And it allows Chinese car manufacturers to bring their products to market, to our markets, for a bargain price. Now, to protect our own market and our industry, higher import tariffs for Chinese electric cars are probably getting unavoidable. And I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan of tariffs, because we know that they can ultimately destroy economic growth. But unfortunately, it more and more looks as if we have no other option. We do this to prevent unfair competition from Chinese car makers, which would otherwise overrun the industry, as, for example, in Europe, it has done with most of our solar panel industry. Another example would be hydrogen. This month, we are proposing the House rules for Europe's next auction of support for hydrogen projects. And while the first auction has actually shown that European electrolyzers have a very good presence, we also saw that China was oversupplying them at ever lower costs. So I will ensure that the next auction is different. We have explicit criteria to allow us to our own supply chains. And projects cannot get support anymore if our cybersecurity and the data safety of our companies are not guaranteed. We see the same drive, of course, in the US to protect key chain technologies from unfair competition. Now, obviously, raising trade defenses doesn't solve everything. But the more the US and the European Union align, the better the results for all of us will be, including for climate action. So I would say, let's team up. Dear students, that brings me to my third topic, doubling down on diplomacy. Europe has been a decades-long leader in the international fight against climate change. And we have driven down our emissions by more than a third. And as I said, we will move to 55% in 2030 and 90% in 2040. But the reality is that will not save the planet, nor will it save Europe. The reason is actually very simple. Today, Europe is responsible for roughly 7% of global emissions. That means that the other 93% are pumped into the air elsewhere. The reality is also that climate change knows no borders. It is indiscriminate and it touches literally all of us, whether you're from the north, the south, the east or the west, regardless of where the emissions take place. So as a global community, no matter how difficult the circumstances are, no matter the global tensions that we all see and we all read about, we basically have no alternative than to work together. Now, I know from experience that international negotiations are always difficult. And even more so if you are around the table literally with almost 200 countries that have to agree on the basis of consensus. And the main question for this year, to make it even more difficult, is who is going to pay the bill? And that is what we have ahead of us at the international climate negotiations called the COP in 47 days from now. For Europe, our ambition is threefold. First, what we want to do is to shore up significantly more resources to address climate change. That means public money, but also making it much easier to involve the private sector. Because public sector alone simply will not do. It will not be enough to fund the bill. Second, we do need to focus the recipients base on those most in need. Think, for example, about the small island development states in the Caribbean or in the Pacific. They bear no responsibility whatsoever for the boiling of the planet. But they are the very first to face the devastating consequences of rising sea levels. And third, in my view, what we do need to do is broaden the contributor base. More countries that can pay simply will have to pay. Make no mistake, Europe will continue to lead on this. We're yearly paying between a quarter and a third of the roughly 100 billion that is the global spend to help developing countries fight climate change. And if you do the numbers, you will find that that is more than our fair share. And that's fine, and that is right, and that is just. As I've just said, with affluence comes responsibility. But it cannot be just us. If you are, for example, the richest country on the planet, if you are the leader of the free world, and you are responsible for 13% of global emissions, like the United States, I think you cannot pay less than half of what your European allies are paying. You are incentivized to do more. And if you are able to embark on a mission to the moon, literally, you are responsible for more than a quarter of global emissions, like China, you cannot hide behind the fact that you used to be a developing country 3 decades ago, and you pay zero. You simply need to do more as well. So a step up is required, basically from all involved. And yes, we are doing much better than we used to be doing roughly a decade ago. The problem is, time is not on our side. The problem simply has become too big. It has taken us too long to start. And the only pathway for this world, for this planet, is to fast forward climate action. Ladies and gentlemen, let me leave you with 2 departing thoughts. The first is, yes, we are truly facing, and certainly your generation is facing, an unprecedented set of challenges and disruptions. It's war, it is tyranny, it is climate change, it is democracy and human rights being on the retreat all across the globe. And yet at the same time, I am convinced, truly convinced, that the US and Europe are able to bear any burden and to solve this as long as we unite and do this together. And that brings me to my second thought. I'm not that old yet, but old enough to subscribe to the notion of the writer Robert Van Gulik, who somewhat jealously wrote in one of his books, "There is no substitute for youth." There's no substitute for youth. And in all honesty, I envy you for basically what you have ahead of you. A new academic year at an amazing university in what I think is the most dynamic city on the planet that proudly calls itself the capital of the world. You are very lucky. You are truly very lucky. So I implore you, please, please, please make the most of it. Expose yourself to new ideas, try new things, meet others, and please, please, please make mistakes. I made a ton of them. And I learned that life is all about trial and error. And if you fall, you simply get up and you continue ever strong. Thank you.
I get to quiz you, and then I get to quiz you, yes. Much like the minus 55 by 2030, the net zero by 2050, and sort of these long-term climate targets, where frankly Europe has been in a leadership role for quite a while. Yeah. And then comes along this young, strapping upstart nation and passes the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022.
Yeah.
And Europe's response is to send several commissioners, not you yet at the time, across the Atlantic to basically plead and say, don't. You are violating trade rules, you're over-subsidizing, a dirty industry left for China, increasingly clean industry left afterwards, and now it's also the hydrogen companies and the Meyer Burgers of the world are going to the US. I realized that would have been a question for your predecessor, your Dutch colleague, but any regrets, right? Sort of any climate policy steps with hindsight 2024, where you would say, actually, Europe should have passed the Clean Industrial Policy Act sooner, or anything along these lines, where you say, now that we know what we know in 2024, we could have, should have, would have.
Well, maybe first on the IRA, because I would tend to think that the picture is much more balanced. And indeed, there were and there still are concerns about Europe, and those center roughly around the whole domain of fairness. I do think what we also recognize is that it has given a huge incentive to companies over here to basically become a lot greener and cleaner. And that is a great thing for the planet. And I admire the US for the boldness of the plan, and of course the speed of its delivery, simply because it has one tax system compared to 27 geographies that we're facing. The speed of the delivery and the practicalities are something, unfortunately, we cannot match. If you would do the numbers, you would find that Europe is still, even if the whole sum of the IRA would double or quadruple, we're outperforming the US in terms of the money spent. If you add up the innovation fund, the social climate fund, all the stuff that is in the 7-year European budget, but the speed of delivery and the simplicity of the system is something we cannot match. That is on the IRA. If you're talking about regrets and also what we did well, I would probably single out two things. I truly think that the ETS, the emissions trading system, is by far the smartest policy tool we have in the whole European Union. Full stop. I didn't design it. I just, I'm learning about it every single day. But if I compare it to what I've seen at a national level and also at a European level, this is truly very sophisticated. And kudos to those who have actually built it. So that is one. That is the thing where we enjoyed tremendous benefits, and we're trying to export this basically to the rest of the world because pricing carbon simply is such an effective thing to do. The regret is actually very simple. If you look at where we are now and why we're facing such a huge problem, the reason is that we started with this whole approach way too late. If we would have realized how severe this was going to be, and we would have put our money where our mouth was 20, 30, 40 years ago, the outlook would be completely different. So we cannot turn back the time. The only thing we can do is do the right things in the present. But it would have been a hell of a lot easier if we would have been where we are today in, let's say, 2010 or 2000.
Now, to be clear, so a fellow Austro-American who might match you in height, when he signed the emissions trading system in California into law, that system from the get-go covered 85% of all greenhouse gases. Mm-hmm. Europe still, to this date, right, is at 50% of CO2 only. There's ETS reform, there's expansion, and so on, right? And when you said you didn't design it, so it turns out Joost Stelbeck did design it, right?
This guy
and
did design it.
This is the Bible here, right? European climate policy making. I didn't print the full 326 pages or so, but there's sort of a new Bible in town, right? The Draghi report that came out a week or so ago. I can't claim I read the whole thing, but when you search for climate and energy, there are plenty of mentions, right? And in many ways, there is this... it's not a regret that is in there, not at all. But he certainly wouldn't say, Draghi in this case, wouldn't say, we should have had a higher price for longer. He is essentially saying, in many ways, we need to figure out how to sort of move toward the ever greater union, competitiveness, fiscal union, the sort of things that, frankly, the US does have. Right? And that, in many ways, California has. Right? Now, not the spending on the state level, but a better pricing system on the one hand, and a better subsidy system. Which points of the Draghi report are now on your agenda as well? And how do you square this circle of, yes, climate leadership, we need to do more, right, and sometimes there are trade-offs?
Well, let me take out three things of the Draghi report that I truly like. One is what he basically says is that we should expose ourselves much more to the whole domain of AI, of tech, of innovation than we currently do. If you would compare the US economy to the European economy, you would find that productivity is in many ways roughly equal, with one very substantial exception, and that is the whole domain of AI and tech and innovation. And why is that a problem? Well, because that is the economy of the future. So you're not just outperformed on some trivial part of the equation, but at the very heart of what is the future. My view is he is spot on in telling us that we need to do more here. That is one. The second thing is, if you would look at the US, you would find there is way more liquidity in the system. Money basically flows across the US. Private sector capital flows across the US. And Europe, for all the goods that the single market has brought, still has 27 countries. And money, even from a country like my own, that has always been on the forefront of trade and also financial capitalism, has a disadvantage compared to the system of the US. So a capital market union is politically not easy in Europe. And I can vividly recall my very first meeting as finance minister in October 2017. We were roughly at the same place where we are today, but it is very much needed. And the economic push it would give to Europe is truly amazing. The third one, and one that is really linked to my portfolio as well, is on energy prices. It truly is, if you look at the numbers, staggering to find what a company is paying in let's say the heavy industry for energy over here compared to Europe. It's a huge competitive disadvantage for a European company. Now you could argue that this will disappear over time, given the tremendous cost curve reduction of particularly solar, but renewables in general, and all the advances we'll see in the domain of batteries. Over time, this might well disappear. But if you are the leader of a company, over time is not good enough. You don't need a solution in 10 years. You need it roughly now. So how it will work exactly, we still need to design. But coming up with a system where we help companies, particularly in our heavy industry, with making this transition, becoming green ASAP, but also being able to stay competitive in the meanwhile, is something where we basically need to put more money into.
So there are some pockets where that works well, right? So northern Sweden, plenty of hydro, some wind, lots of cheap, low carbon, zero carbon electricity is attracting 2 steel plants, green hydrogen, low carbon, zero carbon in many ways, steel plants, right? So this is Norwegian state utility, Statkraft, selling cheap, low carbon electricity to Hybrid Stegra, formerly H2 Green Steel, and allowing the sort of thing, frankly, that actually doesn't happen anywhere in the world.
Right.
Just geographic happenstance, or are they onto something, right? So Sweden both started pricing CO2 when we all should have in the early 1990s, and now they are doing that too. Is this the Swedish model that's ought to apply more broadly?
Well, I mean, the beauty of the European Union, and sometimes also the complexity, is that there is huge diversity in the member states, and much is driven by a combination of history, sometimes literally the landscape and geography, the way populations are located, and of course the economic trajectory they have been on. And of course, Sweden has been doing very well in terms of their economy, the overall performance of their state, and also in the domain of clean energy. Could you automatically import that to all corners of Europe? Probably not lock, stock and barrel. And what we will try to do is make sure that we find those solutions that work basically across the continent. That is also why we're putting so much money in, for example, our innovation fund and all the other parts of the funding instruments, so that we can deal with these type of situations literally from Sweden to Spain to Bulgaria to Ireland, where industries have different histories, where different type of companies are dominant, but where basically all citizens on the one hand want to make sure that their exposure to the new economy is growing, but are also worried. Just for example, people who are working in a coal plant, what it will do to their livelihoods if the plant is being closed. And where retraining is and reschooling is coming from, and where the next job will be. That is as much as I'm in favor of closing these coal plants, it is a fair ask for people who work there what their future will be. And the European Union needs to answer that question just as well.
Now, that often leads to, right, so it's basically who pays, right, is one of the major questions in this case. And not too flippant about this, but there are basically 3 sources of money in the world, right? It's shareholders, taxpayers, or ratepayers, consumers, looking at the energy sector. And there's the global who pays question. You mentioned Baku, COP29, and so on. There's also, of course, the very, very local one. And frankly, this is where politics comes in, which, right, we are not allowed to talk about in a classroom.
Oh, you're not? Okay.
We call it political economy, right? We cite some, long since gone German philosophers and analyze in the third person. But of course, it's politics, right? Sure. This is the day-to-day politics.
Sure.
And this is when the finance minister meets the, minister for climate action, or and they don't always come from the same party, let's say, and that's where the negotiations start. Is it just politics? Or is there sort of some broader agreement where, every once in a while you have maybe one quick thing, carbon border adjustment mechanism, right? We don't have that in the US. We don't have an emissions trading system, so in some sense it's nonsensical to talk about it, but actually that may be the sort of carbon price that we can pass. We have very conservative Senator Cassidy on the one hand, and Senator Whitehouse, not the White House, right? Basically both proposing the exact same thing, and well, maybe that could be the sort of agreement that actually leads to cuts through the politics suddenly. Are there levels like this that you can point to where it's not green versus anything, it's simply good policy?
The first one, who's going to pay? And the answer is all of the above. It's going to be taxpayers, it's going to be consumers, it's going to be shareholders, and of course the recipe might differ over time. But there's no escape. This will cost more money. So if I think about the future of the European Union, and I would need to articulate where substantially more money is needed, it is. In no particular order, it is the whole domain of innovation and AI and tech. It is the whole domain of geopolitics, given the fact that we are in a very, very rough world, and war is back at our borders. And the third one is climate action. All three will cost more money. So that to your first point.
Which, just quickly, if I may, that's exactly the problem, right? Because the defense minister will also want more.
Yeah, but that is the beauty and the difficulty of being in politics. I mean, if there would be no limit to the money you could spend, you would have a relatively easy life. But and I've done that job for 4 years, right? It's all priorities are important, but you are cash constrained. There are limitations to what you can ask from your citizens in terms of taxes. There are limitations to the bill that you can push forward to the next generation. And I mean, of course, you can work on productivity, but still, you can only do so much. So at some point in time, you have to face reality, and you have to do priority setting. And that is, of course, where politics come in, and where political parties tend to disagree and fortunately also agree. Now then, to the two senators you mentioned and CBAM, our mechanism basically that is born out of the ETS. So carbon border adjustment mechanism was born out of the logic that if you have this system in Europe and you want to prevent carbon leaking outside of the European, you need to have some sort of a system that makes it fair for companies that operate in the European Union. Interestingly enough, indeed, you have politicians in the US who like that from a content perspective, so they like it because it enhances climate action. You have others who like it because they see a trade element in it by which they can battle unfair competition. We clearly did it for the very first reason. We did it for us. It is not a trade measure. It is something we did for the simple reason of making sure carbon is not gonna leak. But it is true that we're facing those two problems. We are facing the huge problem of more climate action. But I do sympathize with those senators who are worried about what they see that is happening in cybersecurity, who are worried about what they see is happening in terms of non-level playing field, that are worried about data theft and IP theft. It is happening every single day. I just talked to your experts, so let me give you one other example. If you would read, this is all public information, if you would read the yearly reports of the intelligence services of the Dutch government, all public, you would find that year after year, they have been explicit that China is the single biggest threat for the economic security of the Netherlands. And let's assume for a minute that that is true. Then it would be naive to think that all the other 26 countries of the European Union don't, at least to some extent, have the same problem.
And it is definitely China, not the fact that Dutch dikes are built for the 10 or 100-year storm, not the 200-year storm. So is there a point where climate might overtake some of these national, or where the national security implications of climate suddenly rival the very real economic security question?
It is the sobering reality is that where we might have thought in the past about climate change as something that affects species, the planet, the domain of nature, The reality is that that is true, but on top of that, we're getting a huge financial economic problem. This is truly on top of mind of many CEOs across industries. And third, the geopolitical domain. What is truly interesting and worrying is that some of the folks who are calling me and want to have a conversation are people from the military, because they see that this has ramifications that are typical for their domain. And that is, of course, at a global scale. It is people who will start to move because of drought and tensions and fights over water. So large themes. Sometimes it's also very practical, and they are wondering, okay, so if temperatures go up and fluctuate upwards, what does that do to the feasibility of our planes or our choppers? So it can also be very practical for more the operational side of the military.
Let's open this up. Fun to nerd out over CBAM and Stagger and so on, but any questions?
Thank you for the speech and also the Q&A. I think very informative. One of the topics that really resonated with me was keeping citizens on board with the plans that we have in Europe. I see myself like two big challenges happening in Europe. Like one is keeping people on board with like prioritizing action on climate change. I think we see it in our own country. Mm-hmm. We see quite a vocal people in politics that are now saying, hey, we maybe shouldn't comply with some of the agreements that we made in Europe. And you also see some other countries in European Union like not prioritizing climate. I think the second challenge is there are some countries that do prioritize climate, like let's say Germany, but they do have quite some interest in how the future is going to look like. We know, for example, in the steel industry in Germany, now very competitive, but as we move to a more green industry, they will pay such high electricity prices that they are very unlikely to be very competitive. So you see Germany also implementing its own industrial policy on top of what we have as Europe as a whole. So it's quite a complex field. How do you think about the channels that are available for you to ensure that you keep those citizens and countries on board with the European plans?
So I'm not going to hide the fact that this is hugely complex, and this is, I think, at the heart of the matter. It's a while ago, it was maybe good enough, or it seemed good enough to articulate the huge damage that climate change is doing. But that not only as a narrative, but also as a solution, in my view, is no longer good enough. It will only work if we combine basically four things. It is relentless climate action, simply because do the math, listen to scientists, there is no escape. But we need to marry that with, as you mentioned, a just transition for our people, and that is hugely complex because that is to some extent the prerogative of member states, but the European Union can play a very important role there as well. The third part is making sure that companies survive, basically what we just discussed, for the simple reason that if companies either go bust or leave the European Union, we're not doing anyone a favor. And certainly not climate, because then at lower standards, others or them will be producing outside of our borders. And the fourth one is clearly diplomacy. And that brings me back to the speech. It's not good enough to just solve it in the European Union. You will not live happily ever after. You're still stuck with the 93%. So it's each of these elements that we need to bring together. And sometimes it gets very practical. I just gave you the example of the factory that closes. It matters a lot for a breadwinner and for a family whether you lose one job in, for example, a coal mine or at a plant, and there is a training program, and there is another company, and there is a way to make sure that you will do something different, but there is a decent living and and a sustainable income to be had, or you're basically on your own. That is a huge difference, and of course that also makes all the difference for the support climate policies will continue to have. And therefore, I always articulate that a one-dimensional answer politically simply is not going to be good enough, and it is not going to be good enough in the reality of our societies either.
I don't see your name, but behind Pim. Yeah, go ahead.
It's only those three people in the front who have their name tags on.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
it's,
My name is Thijs. I work for the Dutch Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management. I'd like to look into EU policy tools. Looking at EU declarations, how do you value them? For example, an EU declaration on cycling.
And I'm sure there's something specific in there. I'm long enough in politics to know that there is a trap somewhere in the question. So I want to know what is in there, and I want to know, what the specific question is.
Love for you to say, I love cycling, I'm going to use it for everything. But in reality, I am always learning more things about the EU. I'm very curious about your experience as a commissioner, to learn how you see that as a way to address certain topics.
And you want me to link this to cycling?
Just the declarations of that the EU uses.
Well, I mean, what is a declaration to a country? And don't think too lightheartedly about it. It takes a lot of painful diplomatic work before you have a declaration and you have a government, let alone a couple of governments agree on it. But a declaration is an intent. It is something you aspire to do, and you typically try to solidify later on with others, and you come to agreements and potentially to treaties or to laws. But it typically starts with an intent, and that is what you then use. In terms of the domain of cycling, of course, I'm absolutely biased because I'm coming from a country where there are more bikes than people. And one of the reasons is that these bikes get stolen all the time, so then you need a new one. But it's in an overcrowded place like the Netherlands, it's an extremely effective way of commuting. And I would love to see that as a solution in many other places. And people are opening up to this in Belgium. In France, Paris in particular. But I was with my good friend Roberto Golcieri. He's the mayor of Rome. And we took a biking tour from his office to the Colosseum. And of course, many people thought, who are those two weirdos on bikes with policemen around them? But it's something that probably would have been inconceivable 20, 30 years ago. And now we're embarking on this part of the solution space, but it's not just this. It's basically here as well. It's all of the above, simply because the problem is so large.
Thanks.
Alexa, go ahead.
Thank you for visiting us. I would love to hear a little bit more about your take on CBAM. As thank you for the experiment. We appreciate that. I know it's only been in place since 2023 or so. But if there's been a little bit of analysis, some look at how it's going thus far, and would love to hear a little bit in terms of your take on it thus far, and then the future of it. Because if I understand correctly, it's expiring at some point, right? The near future?
Well, I hope not. It's but maybe a couple of things about it. And what is interesting is that it is something that is quite often discussed in panels, but also with many of the interlocutors I'm meeting from all over the world. And sometimes it is deliberately framed as an unfair practice or as something that is at the expense of others from across the globe. The reality is, it is a tool for fairness. It is a tool for enhancing climate action. And the good news is actually there is significant anticipation effect. That is true in general for the whole discussion about pricing carbon and ETS type of systems. You mentioned California, but Quebec is having the same. the Chinese are doing it. When I was last year in Chile and Brazil, they were both having discussions in their parliaments on this, because everyone sees that the most effective thing you can do is basically pricing carbon. So CBAM, there is a significant anticipation effect, and why it is particularly interesting is that if you look actually at the size of the price, that is fairly limited. Our assessment, that we don't know for sure, but our assessment is that roughly around 2030, the money that comes out of it is probably not much more than 3 billion, which on a global scale actually is pretty small. And it also tells you that, I mean, if this were a trade tool, which it clearly isn't, it wouldn't move the needle. But of course, the best thing we would like to see, and the ideal situation, is that CBAM actually isn't making any money. Because if CBAM would not be making any money, it would tell us that the stuff we import into the European Union is okay in terms of carbon. And that is precisely what we should have. Now, maybe one last thing, and then I'm back to the senators you mentioned. Ideally, the world really makes a step up in terms of pricing carbon, not only in domestic markets, but also in terms of the carbon that comes in, because that would have a hugely higher amount of anticipation effects to it. And it would push companies to no longer pollute, but basically become cleaner much more quickly. So if that is possible, and diplomatically it will be extremely difficult, but if that is possible, I would immediately seize the opportunity to do it. So Dino, I hope that is a bit of a sufficient answer to your question.
Yeah, to be clear, it's sort of a high-class problem to have, right? But sort of CBAM not making any money is a good sign. Carbon taxes not making any money might be an even better sign.
I mean, it's
slightly farther in the future.
It's further out, but it's with many of these things. I once talked to a doctor who is an expert in the kids' cancer research, and he built an amazing hospital in a city in the Netherlands. And he said, "My dream is that we can close this place." In a way, the same is true with taxing carbon. At some point in time, and ideally sooner rather than later, you don't make any money out of it because you have fixed us pumping carbon into the air.
Hi. I'm not sure this is...
Yes, it's on. Go ahead.
I wanted to ask you about carbon capture and storage. It's been billed in the US as a way to transition those hard-to-transition sectors like electricity generation and others. Are there any carbon capture and storage projects in the EU that are working effectively on a commercial scale? And going forward, how much of a role do you see it playing in the transition?
It's a very, very good question. And by the way, this is hugely political. You will find that on balance, and I'm exaggerating a bit, you will find that half of the political family will tell you that this is the solution for all our problems, and you will see that people on the other side of the spectrum are basically saying this is one big hoax. The reality, as I see it, is that there is no substitute for significantly driving down emissions. You cannot CCS yourself out of this problem. It simply will not work. You have to drive down emissions. Is it then possible that somewhere in that equation, CCS comes in and could be a solution for some of the hardest to abate sectors? Well, yes, maybe. But then I would like to see the proof of that truly happening. I think that is in the end, I have an agnostic view on these type of technologies. The only thing I care about is, do they work and are they cost effective? And the jury is out, to be frank.
EU countries that have effectively scaled it to commercial scale?
Well, they are in the process of doing it. For example, I saw or I was talking to people who are working on this in Sweden, and I would love to see it. I would love to see them prove the critics wrong, because then we have another part of the solution space that apparently works. But don't be lured into the logic of some who typically come from the fossil fuel industry, who will tell you that magically this is going to make the problem go away. Magic, at least in my experience, simply doesn't exist.
Okay, so I see I'm no longer in charge of deciding who is asking the next question, which is okay. I am in charge of closing on time, which means this might be the moment to collect maybe 2 very short questions and then make this the last round. Whoever, yes, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Natalie Duncan. I'm an alumni from the Sustainability Science Master's program here. I currently work in corporate sustainability consulting, and I'm curious how CSRD fits into your image of the transition for the EU, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive.
In my view, it is hugely important, and it might sound like a paradox, but we have both an opportunity to do more and make it simpler. Look, the companies complaining about bureaucracy and about reporting is something that has been there for decades, and it will stay with us for eternity. But is there some merit to their point? Probably there is. I think we can make it simpler. We can make it more specific. Also, that we basically, as consumers, get a bit of a feel for, what is this company truly doing? Because you are an expert, you know how this works. But I find it as a consumer pretty difficult to basically make a distinction between company A in sector X and company B in sector X. I cannot tell. And I'm utterly confused when I'm in the supermarket and I'm shopping for products and I see all sorts of labels with messages that they are, the greenest, the cleanest, the healthiest. So I think there's a lot more that we can do in simplify it, so that consumers can actually bring this into the equation of the choices they make.
We began with the Dutch question and we'll end with the Dutch question. Quint.
Thank you. Yeah, so Quint, also a student at the business school. I was wondering, you were talking about innovation and how that's a very important factor in solving the climate crisis. What I find interesting when I look at innovation in Europe is that it's usually very small initiatives, and there are many of these in Europe. Usually, Europe is like at the forefront of small initiatives when it comes to climate technology, but it never scales, or it hardly ever scales. Whereas in the US or China, it scales and then they become the world leader in a new technology. What tools do you have, or what do you intend to do to make sure that we do get these European climate unicorns?
Yeah, so by the way, I was not talking about innovation just limited to the domain of the climate tech. And that's I think it is a broader issue actually for the European Union, but actually for all these sectors, what you're saying is absolutely true. The number of startups is actually quite decent. Certainly in the Netherlands, but in general in Europe that is pretty okay. What we don't see is that many companies that make it beyond $1 billion. And one of the reasons for that is, and now we're back to the beginning, if you are, let's say you're an entrepreneur from Belgium, you have a market of, roughly 12, 13 million inhabitants. If you're if you want to dominate your country, that is basically your market size. Now imagine you're that same entrepreneur in the US. Where do we stand today? 340 million inhabitants. It's a completely different scale. So what we need to do is make sure we embark on that capital markets union and we further solidify and smoothen the single market. It's one of the great successes of Europe, but it needs further revision so that entrepreneur is almost logically seeing the market of the 27, even though it's countries have their own tax systems and have their own languages, is the marketplace for that entrepreneur. In my view, that is the only way to solve it. Otherwise, that entrepreneur might still be tempted to move over here, for example.
Let us thank the Commissioner.
Thank you. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode featuring Commissioner Wopke Hoekstra and Professor Gernot Wagner. Quick closing words from me. Commissioner Hoekstra emphasized the importance of keeping citizens on board in the fight against climate change. He stressed the need to deliver a four-part message that includes acknowledging the real threat of climate change, ensuring a just and fair transition to clean energy, providing assurances that businesses will survive through this transition, and emphasizing the necessity of diplomacy as this problem cannot be solved in isolation by any one country or geographical area. It's a tough message to land as a whole, but as business leaders and global citizens, it's important we know where we can authentically make an impact, then focus our communication there, because the problem is not going away, and as Commissioner Hoekstra explained, the impacts are felt environmentally, financially, and geopolitically, each of which we feel directly. Stay connected with CBS to learn more about how the school is helping students lead in the business of climate change by following us on social media. Thank you for listening.